For the longest time, Star Citizen has depended on Armistice zones to determine player safety and rule enforcement. But in the background, security systems have been in development to offer a more immersive, gamified way to do the same thing. Star Citizen's new contested zones have been added to the roadmap for 4.0, and they look to be the first place we'll see some form of these security systems in testing. These locations look a lot like the dark zones in the Division series by Massive Entertainment. By manipulating power and doors in an abandoned part of the space stations of Pyro, players can battle constantly active NPCs and potentially other players to hold locations and find new types of loot. These new contested zones could be the site of the most exciting and, of course, most marketable gameplay Star Citizen offers so far. But with Star Citizen's glitchy nature, also opens players up for some pretty disappointing scenarios. And yes, it is more combat in Star Citizen, but they do represent a much needed gameplay expansion to the game. Let's talk about these locations and what they mean for the more risky players among us. Let us start the new hype season for 4.0 for the 6th time. Thank you for coming to my Tomato Talk. Before we truly get into things, if you're looking for more in-depth discussions about these topics, criticisms, praises, and interesting points, I host a podcast with a new guest every week from the community to discuss Star Citizen, No Man's Sky, Star Wars Outlaws, and other space games in their development. It's on the second channel Space Tomato 2, which I have linked down below for you. Now, so the basic explanation of how these contested zones work is this. Pyro space stations will have abandoned sections with sporadic power and access. You'll be able to leave the Armistice protected social areas and enter these free-for-all areas that feature multiple paths, NPCs that will essentially live in these areas and respawn over time if killed, security systems, other players, and the most valuable loot likely in the game. Not only are these areas hosted in stations that you may have trouble accessing due to reputation, they are also in the Pyro system. Pyro isn't completely lawless. The gangs keep some form of peace that they have to agree on, but it is certainly more dangerous than Stanton, and these locations are at the end of the yellow brick road of nonsense that is the online gaming community. So once you get into these places, likely with the group, you'll need to navigate what we've found to be much more vertically inclined space stations than we've known. There will be hazards like mines and security turrets, but also a lot of places for platforming. Climbing, jumping, crawling, and finding alternate routes to get around blocked paths. This essentially is an extraction shooter scenario. What you find in the zone, if CIG is doing this right, could potentially be your next favorite weapon, or an actual trophy you can go back to Stanton and show off to your friends in your new personal hangar. A sign that you went into the storm to weather the most violent, broken AI and the most annoying players in the game, rather than simply subscribing for a nice paint. No offense, annoying is good in this scenario. You gotta get your booty. Now, as you can see, these being space stations means that most of the combat is gonna be pretty close quarters. No vehicles, limited snipers, and not much opportunity for threats to come out of nowhere besides, hiding. With no artificial matchmaking or player limits, there's no knowing how this plays out until it actually happens. It'll likely be kinda chaos, but the team still has a lot of control over how it plays out with all these natural gates to access. Hopefully, the different areas and space stations have some actual diversity, considering the space stations in Pyro supposedly have some variety, but I wouldn't expect major differences between the locations just yet, personally. This whole system is all very dependent on the resource network, which is mainly associated with ships, as that's really all we've ever seen it with, besides a couple teasers here and there, but it will function in space stations, outposts, and cities as well. Basically, anywhere there are resources. If CIG really does tie this system into the controls, we may see more options added to these areas over time as resources develop that allow us to get a little strategic. And interestingly, in the preview, we do actually see mention of atmosphere scrubbers, so there may be potential to play with the life support in these areas as well, as many of them do have life support turned off by default. Along with resource management, security terminals will also be accessible through the use of security cards and possibly codes that are retrieved from NPCs in the areas. Once you've retrieved these cards though, you'll need to make sure the sweaties don't get you. Now of course you could come across the loot of these locations in somebody else's inventory down the line if you're that kind of player. We are playing a full loot game after all. But these locations are actually introducing a real goal for players, a reason to go to a location and strategize in order to achieve a goal, and a situation that pits the most violent players up against each other to have a little more fun. Combined with fully persistent NPC enemies, all of this is something Star Citizen has basically never had before, other than in Security Post Korea with its crime stat hacking feature, which is pretty limited in size and availability. The disappointing thing about this whole system though, and a lingering major problem with the game at large, is all you need to do to get away from danger in these areas is step back through a door into the Armistice zone. Just like how in the Stanton system, all you need to do to escape a bounty is go to a landing zone. As I said at the beginning of the video, Armistice zones are necessary at the moment because security systems, NPCs, and reputation are still not developed enough to offer in-game natural methods of deterrence and consequence to bad actors. A lot of this really comes down to the fact that the back-end and networking side of this game can't keep up with everything, but we also just need to see a big expansion on development with the reputation system. This really holds Star Citizen back from a more immersive experience and a system of action and consequence. Especially in a system like Pyro, where we're heavily dependent on the reputation system with gangs and the danger of no overarching government entity, Armistice zones feel even more artificial. In the Stanton system, a bounty hunter should be able to earn the trust of the guild and local authorities to carry a non-lethal gun into the city to track down their target and subdue them, but that's just not possible with the current limitations. And that, overall, is a problem for the game. I do hope as we approach the launch of this update, CIG reiterates if this is how they want things to be long term, or if they are sticking to the idea of more natural methods of controlling player behavior. It's a big sticking point for many players and a main topic I did discuss with University of Stanton on my podcast this week. Link to that is down below. All that being said, this kind of gameplay, as I covered in a recent video, is entirely disconnected from what many players come to Star Citizen for. While these aren't on-the-rails missions, they are a continuation of a combat focus. This is not necessarily the gameplay for me, but coming from an FPS background, I do enjoy some pew-pew. Regardless, I am mostly here to advocate for the explorers, the foragers, and those looking to peacefully search for and exploit valuables around the verse. Pyro is not the end of this game's development. Considering the state of the game engine, really this is almost the beginning of the actual game being built. Thanks, Squadron 42. What I do hope to start seeing more of is the social and creative aspects of Star Citizen, utilizing the star map, the upcoming quantum travel changes, and the various points of interest being introduced to the game. Now we do have a look into the social aspects of Pyro coming up soon, but I can't wait for it to become more of a main point of communication with the company. The first thing I did see when previewing these abandoned locations last year at CitizenCon was an opportunity for exploration, for searching the long abandoned areas of Pyro that may be risky to reach, but allow for some in-depth treasure hunting. Ultimately, as the game does progress and expand, these locations will naturally have less players looking to kill you and more opportunities for you to just platform and find the most valuable things. As long as they don't start marking areas around the game as contested PvP-capable areas. I think that should be something that more naturally presents itself. And I do think those things are coming, but until features like FPS scanning, quantum boosting, and a more robust selection of props, loot, and the associated art from the studio are in the game, they will continue to depend on combat features to build interesting gameplay scenarios. What we're seeing with Pyro is a mixture of gameplay that leans more into aggression, but I do think it'll offer a challenge for the players willing to defend themselves, but not necessarily get into combat on their own. When we start seeing more of that in development and coming to the game, I'll be right here to let you know, but until then, these seem to be Star Citizen's own dark zones coming in Alpha 4.0. Thanks for watching this video. I'm more focused on quicker news drops for you all now as a mix between my feature watches and tomato talks, and I'll continue to develop this format until I think it fits what I'd like. As always, I'd love to hear what you think of them, and let me know what you think of these new locations coming to 4.0. And if you'd like to support these videos, get more in-depth monthly exclusives about the history and development of Star Citizen, get some live podcast access, and maybe your own referral code in our referral randomizer under every video, you can support me on Patreon or right here on YouTube. I hope you learned something new in this video, and I'll catch you in the next.